So Aaron's back. And after that, we'll get into what's actually happening in Ukraine, because I think one of the most dangerous deceptions is being set up. But and thank you everyone who encouraged me and has been supportive after that speech. Obviously, the other delegations were not very supportive. It was pretty instructive. So yeah, I mean, I guess let's get started with part of my speech. And this, I'm just joining the club here. Aaron has spoken, what, 3 times to the UN?
Yeah, 3 times.
And, so you spoke at the Area Formula meeting, right?
Yeah, I've never gotten to before a full meeting of the Security Council. The meetings I've spoken in were like it's a special meeting of the Security Council, but what you spoke at was a regular meeting. And I would have bet anything that they were going to block you, because that's what they did to Jose Bustani, the first Director General of the OPCW, when he was going to come forward and testify at a full UN meeting in support of the dissenting OPCW whistleblowers and speak out against the cover-up of the Duma investigation. He was blocked by the US, UK, and France. And I was sure that they were going to do that to you again. So I was pleasantly surprised when I saw the footage of you speaking. And that was a great speech. And I guess, I'm sure it crossed their minds, but I guess they decided that the optics of blocking a, American journalist in a, speaking about a war in which they claim to be defending democracy, that just wouldn't have been a good look. So, it's great you got the opportunity, and that was a wonderful speech. I'm very thankful to you for delivering it.
Thanks. Well, everyone's thankful for your interventions. And I think on a certain level, they might have made more of an impact because it was so focused tightly on one issue and one institution, which operates under the umbrella of the UN, the OPCW, whereas mine was sort of a broader portrait of hypocrisy and lies and corruption that are driving this war. I was asked to speak specifically about U.S. aid and, Western quote unquote aid to Ukraine, and how flooding the battlefield with weapons is just escalating the conflict and could destabilize the region. So I tried to stay focused on that. I was told, I got 12 minutes. And there was a debate the night before. I heard, vague ruminations about what was taking place. There was a debate, and there was a lot of anger about me and Che Bose, Irish journalist, who's now, I guess he's a correspondent at RT now, being invited to speak. And so the Brits decided to bring a historian from the Kissinger Institute at Johns Hopkins SAIS, which is sort of like a neocon training institute in DC, to counter us instead of blocking us. And they might, I don't know, maybe they thought that we were going to embarrass ourselves or that they would be able to denounce us, but I don't think it worked out their way. And what I wanted to do is not just discuss how weapons, the presence of small, just waves and waves of small arms, which are often delivered through straw buyers by the CIA without any transparency, but also, the heavy weapons, the tanks, the F-16s are, I didn't just want to address how they're escalating the conflict, but I wanted to expose or explode the logic that's been fed to the US public to justify flooding Ukraine with weapons rather than negotiating. And one of the key arguments that's been fed to us is sort of like the argument that was fed to us during the run-up to the Iraq War, which Sergei Rodchenko, the British guest speaker, attempted to spout back to me, which is that we're defending freedom. This is just about freedom. We're defending democracy. And so here's part of my speech where I address that obvious lie. And keep in mind that right to my left is the Ukrainian delegation, the Ukrainian ambassador.
Why are we doing this? Why are we attempting nuclear annihilation by flooding Ukraine with advanced weapons and sabotaging negotiations at every turn? We've been told by people like Senator Dick Durbin that Ukraine is literally in a battle for freedom and democracy itself. And therefore, anyone who opposes military aid to Ukraine opposes the very defense of democracy, according to this logic. So where's the democracy in Vladimir Zelensky's decision to ban opposition parties, to criminalize the media outlets of his legitimate political opponents, to jail his top political rival and his deputies, to raid Orthodox churches and jail clergymen? Where is the democracy in the Ukrainian government's imprisonment of Gonzalo Lira, an American citizen, simply for challenging the official narrative of Ukraine's war? And where is the democracy in Zelensky's recent decision to suspend elections in 2024 on the grounds that martial law has been declared? The answer is that Ukrainian democracy is harder to find these days than that country's commander-in-chief, Valery Zaluzhny. Senator Lindsey Graham has offered a much more grim and more on-the-mark rationale for supplying Ukraine with billions in weapons. As the senator boasted during a recent visit with Zelensky in Kiev, the Russians are dying. It's the best money we've ever spent. I repeat, the Russians are dying. It's the best money we've ever spent. And Graham has also said that Americans are ready to fight this war down to the last Ukrainian. While official casualty numbers are strictly classified, we must worry that Ukraine is well on its way to fulfilling the senator's ghoulish fantasies. As a Ukrainian soldier complained this month to Vice News, we don't know what Zelensky's plans are, but, quote, it looks like the extermination of its own population, like of the combat-ready and working-age population. That's it. Indeed, military cemeteries in Ukraine are expanding almost as rapidly as the Northern Virginia McMansions and beachfront estates of executives from Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and assorted Beltway contractors benefiting from the second highest level of military spending since World War II. These are the real winners of the Ukraine proxy war, not average Ukrainians or Americans or Russians. The winners, or Europeans for that matter, the winners are people like Secretary of State Tony Blinken, who spent his time between the Obama and Biden administrations launching a consulting firm called West Exec Advisors, which secured lucrative government contracts for intelligence firms and the arms industry. Blinken's former partners at West Exec include Director of National Intelligence Avril Haines, CIA Deputy Director David Cohen, former White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki, and almost a dozen current and former members of Biden's national security team. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin, for his part, is a former and possibly future board member of Raytheon, and an ex-partner of Pine Island Capital Investment, which collaborates with West Exec and which Blinken himself has advised. Meanwhile, the current U.S. ambassador to this body, the UN, Linda Thomas Greenfield, is listed as a senior counsel at the Albright Stonebridge Group, a self-described commercial diplomacy firm that also finesses government contracts for the intelligence and arms sector, and which was founded by Madeleine Albright, infamously known for her comments that the deaths by sanctions of 500,000 Iraqi children were worth it. So while military-age Ukrainian men are ripped off the streets by military police and sent to the front lines, the financially and politically connected architects of this proxy war are planning to walk through the revolving door to reap unimaginable profits once their time in the Biden administration is over. For them, a negotiated settlement to this territorial dispute means an end to the cash cow of close to $150 billion in U.S. aid to Ukraine. Why are
So yeah, felt good getting that off my chest. Can you dig it?
I can dig it. That's a lot of, I just, whenever you hear all those facts, it's just a reminder that we're denied all that information everywhere else. It's just like information's become so siloed that there's only a small group of us willing to acknowledge the facts that you lay so many of those there. And it's just like, when you hear them in a public forum, it's just a reminder to me of how they're denied everywhere else. And so it's great you had that opportunity, and you certainly took full advantage of it because you packed so much in. How long you spoke for? What, 12 minutes, 13 minutes?
I spoke for like, I actually had a timer on, like I put my stopwatch on next to me, and for some reason I didn't turn, how your screen will go dark, and I didn't I didn't put it on never go dark, didn't set it to that. So I had to keep like resetting my screen so I knew what the time was.
Right.
Because I was worried that I might have to actually cut several sections on the spot just to make the mark. And I went to about 12 minutes and 40 seconds. And the chair of the meeting actually reprimanded me for going over my time, which was unusual. Linda Thomas Greenfield wasn't across from me. They had like the deputy ambassador.
Yeah.
But I could see them kind of visibly wincing when I called her out. I mean, Albright Stonebridge, it's like a complete grift. for the intelligence sector and arms industry. West Exec Advisors, it's one of the most corrupt arrangements we've ever seen with an administration. And it functioned as a kind of out of office mafia for the Biden national security team. Jen Psaki was actually advising an Israeli surveillance company on behalf of West Exec. I mean, that's where they get their money from. Tony Blinken lives in a multi-million-dollar home in Chevy Chase in DC. That's where his money is coming from.
Yeah.
And he himself has said that Ukraine is an opportunity. The Nord Stream bombing presents an opportunity for the liquid natural gas industry in the US. So he has explicitly described this war as a financial opportunity. And so my point was, and the point that I was building up to, is that when you have a member of the Security Council that is controlled by a bipartisan regime that seeks profit in extending this conflict and which actively sabotages negotiations, as Angela Merkel, former German chancellor, has acknowledged, the United Nations has to take action to restrain that member, to put them on a leash. And the rest of my speech was, or a lot of my speech was about how the weapons are not monitored at all by Congress. The weapons deals, what happens with the weapons, are not monitored by Congress. And Ukraine has been using them for things like attacking the Kakhovka Dam with HIMARS rockets, which may have destabilized the dam to the point where once enough pressure was put on it, it just simply exploded. I don't know why the New York Times hasn't considered that possibility. And they made up this whole chart of how the Russians, using Soviet blueprints, bombed it from inside with absolutely no evidence. It's like, here's how Russia could have done it. We're not going to tell you that Ukraine actually attacked the dam itself several months before with US supplied rockets. And we have no idea what they're doing with these weapons. But so there's no monitoring system internally in the US. There's no audit. I quoted Heather Kaiser's audit at length, which we've published at the Grayzone, that Anya Parampil and I collaborated on, which shows how much we don't know about where our money is going and how it's going to, for example, a TV station in Toronto, a Polish think tank that lobbies for NATO, a pro-free market investment banker in Kiev who got $1 million from USAID, and on and on and on. Rural farmers in Kenya. This is a brilliant investigation by Heather Kaiser, who's a former military intelligence officer who served in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I mentioned it just to show how important it is for an international body to monitor the United States, because our internal corruption prevents the rest of the world from even knowing what the Ukrainian battlefield is being flooded with.
And I also like how you contrasted the billions of dollars being spent on the proxy war in Ukraine with the neglect of basic needs here at home in the US. And I think you even started out your speech, or at least in the early part of it, you talked about East Palestine and decaying infrastructure across the country. And that's an important contrast that we just don't get. We're supposed to forget, as you know, this country faces so many issues, that so much money is being spent for this senseless and catastrophic proxy war. I mean, I've been visiting LA, so just seeing the homeless issue here alone, like imagine what even a fraction of that money could be done, could do to address the issue here. But you can't ask that question because we're all supposed to get behind the war.
Well, it's not that you can't ask it. It's clear where the elite priorities are. And the toxic chemical spill I mentioned was actually in the Montana River, not East Palestine, because this happened last week. These are happening so frequently. I think it might be the fifth one since East Palestine, or the third one. So it's polluted a pristine river, which is near the Yellowstone. And what we can tell what our elite priorities are when we turn on CNN, and they're not talking about this. They're not talking about anything that's happening to working Americans. I just was watching CNN, and for the bulk of the hour, there were specials on an 11-year-old Ukrainian boy, and then on how Ukraine's counteroffensive might actually pick up steam and go well. And they brought in some Renta general, Mark Hertling, to talk endlessly about what he would do if he was in command of the Ukrainian army. So it's obvious that this aid is the priority for the people who have skin in the game, who are going to get the kickbacks. It is a gigantic money laundering operation. And yeah, by the way, I mean, the quality of the speech would not have been what it was without the team effort at the Grayzone. Anya Parampil helped me a lot with the language, and Wyatt Reed and Alex Rubenstein helped a lot on the research side. So this really was a team effort. So if you're supporting the Grayzone, I mean, this is what you're supporting across the board. We're all pooling together to stage guerrilla style interventions like this. We really don't have a voice here. Boeing, Raytheon, BlackRock, which owns most of Ukraine's sovereign debt, they have a voice. And so we just have to look for opportunities to find it. And this was a rare opportunity to do so, just like the area meetings you spoke at.
Well, congrats, Max. It was great, cathartic for a lot of people watching it, and the response I've seen has just been overwhelmingly positive, of course, because people, we live in a society, those of us in the NATO world at least are just constantly denied the truth and constantly being fed distortions. And so anytime that wall of propaganda is pierced, it's a cathartic thing. And that your speech was a rare moment. So thank you for that.
So yeah, it was interesting to be in there too. I don't know what and thank you, what your impressions were of being in the UN, but it was clear why the US pays to host the UN. You can see the Russian delegation gets harassed by reporters on their way in. And the Al Jazeera reporter, who was British, the line that he was using to mess with the Russian ambassador was exactly the same line that the Ukrainian, US, and UK delegations were going to use inside, which is that Putin had previously said that he had nothing to do with the Wagner group, and then, had to announce that that the Kremlin or the Russian state was funding Wagner in order to show responsibility for what was taking place. And that was fascinating. I came with Michael Tracy and Randy Credico, and they had difficulty getting in.
I'm surprised they didn't declare a no-fly zone over the UN with that crew. You, Michael Tracy, and Randy Credico.
Well, they're pretty intimidating. So no, the guard tried to stop them from coming in and said they didn't have the right passes. And I'd heard from the Iranian delegation that they're constantly being harassed about passes and just every ticky-tack violation just to make their lives miserable. I was wondering if this was sort of reflective of the same phenomenon. And then you just get in there and you see that every country gangs up on Russia, except for the few neutral countries like Gabon. It was really interesting to see Kenya, formerly a British colony, spout the same line as its former British colonial masters. Well, Gabon, which is a non-aligned country, calls for neutrality. The Brazilian ambassador called for negotiations, which was interesting. Seated next to him was the Ecuadorian ambassador. Ecuador is controlled by a pro-US kind of right of center government. And they basically said the same thing as the US. And then, Aaron, I guess the UK attacked you when you spoke. They didn't acknowledge me publicly, but they were very angry about my presence, as I later found out through the famous Thomas Phipps, who just completely melted down on Twitter and showed how trashy British diplomats really are. But the Albanians took the role of attacking me, and they were seated right next to the Americans, and the American staff, it was indistinguishable from the Albanians. And it really felt like the Americans had actually written the Albanian speech, because when the Albanian ambassador was attacking me, the US deputy ambassador was sitting there just like he, I did this. But Albania being one of the only countries in the world other than Kosovo where George W. Bush is popular.
Yeah. Well, that's my impression too. My impression at the meetings I've spoken at was that the US delegation is sort of checked out, but there are other, junior partners who get tasked with being the attack dogs. And in my case with Syria, it's especially been the UK, who, like the British ambassador once said that you shouldn't trust me because of my Twitter account. That's what he said. And he didn't say, what about my Twitter account was untrustworthy? He just basically made a reference to Twitter as if that somehow bears on the substance of the story I'm talking about, which is the OPCW scandal. But anyway, and then the last time this British diplomat Thomas Phipps said I can't be trusted because people have disproven me online, but of course he didn't give any examples because he can't.
Right.
And the U.S. delegation is always just seems like the U.S. diplomats that I've interacted with seem really checked out. Like they're just kind of they're reading from a prepared script, and they don't actually seem like the British at least seem passionate about what they're doing. The U.S. delegation to me always seemed checked out. Maybe it's different because the issue is Syria, and the UK has always been farmed out to handle that portfolio. But it's interesting to witness. I wouldn't be surprised at all if in your case these other countries were given the task of going after you, because the U.S. wants to, pretend as if it's above this level and doesn't want to acknowledge criticism, doesn't want to engage with it. So it would make sense to me that they would farm it out to somebody else. The only time I've ever seen them kind of somewhat acknowledge the dissenting points of view on the issue of Syria and the OPCW is when Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, former chief of staff to Colin Powell, when he testified alongside me at one of these UN meetings. And because of his rank, as a U.S. veteran, as a former senior official, they had to acknowledge him and thank him for his service, but then try to explain why they think he's wrong. But that's the only time I've ever seen them acknowledge any of their critics.
Yeah, they thought they were too dignified to acknowledge me. And they were so dignified. I don't have his tweet in front of me, but Thomas Phipps just launched this personal tirade against me after very dignified. He calls me a rich boy who took a suspicious trip to Moscow. And so if I'm simultaneously a Russia-funded and trust funded, I guess he thinks I'm a rich boy because I have like an influential Jew dad. Because no one ever produces evidence of my wealth. Like, why don't I live in some anywhere near like where he lives?
Yeah, and actually, I've seen your house, and I can vouch for the fact that you are not living in a rich boy house. I can testify to that.
Well, I don't know if I should take that as a compliment or what, but the point is we work for a living over here. We do depend on your support. But if I were really rich, what I would do is I would buy the Guardian, and then I would republish all of Kit Clarenberg's pieces about the covert activity of the UK in the Ukraine, carrying out literal terror attacks, planning terror attacks like the bombing of the Kerch Bridge, like raising a partisan army in Odessa, and carrying out attacks on Crimea. This is what we've been exposing, and the British media has completely ignored it. And I'd commission a Guardian writer to cover Kit being detained and interrogated by British counter-terror police for the crime of journalism. And of course, we would clamor for Julian Assange's release every day. That's what I'd do if I were genuinely rich, because they're the ones who control the mainstream press. And the reason the Grayzone exists is because, we scrape together whatever we can. But the point is, that is British diplomacy right there. It's not diplomacy at all. It's just all they are is a channel for American military power. And Thomas Phipps could be replaced with just like a set of really rotten teeth, and they would have the same result at the UK. There's literally nothing. He literally has no point. He's a superfluous human being. He could be replaced with like a rotten meat pie and nothing would change.
Meat pie.
Or whatever they call him. Just a pile of haggis.
That reminds me of that British cuisine that I've yet to learn to love. Meat pies. Well, Max, what was I going to say? Did they challenge a single point or fact that you raised? Because
no, as with you and Che Bose really brought it too. I mean, he gave a detailed presentation on how small arms have just alone have destabilized the situation in Ukraine, and provided a lot of context based on what took place in Northern Ireland. And neither of us were challenged. The Irish broadcaster RTE actually, and this was obviously like the best response they could muster, published some smear piece on Che Bose, but the Ukrainian ambassador said some nasty remarks, and that was it. here's who is Che Bose and why did he speak?
Hmm.
Why haven't I gotten one? I'm kind of wondering with this response why there haven't been like 17 articles in the Daily Beast attacking me, but maybe they're taking a while. Alexander Reed Ross usually takes like 7 months to do anything, but
to do like a bottomless rant, yeah, that does take a while, I guess. But yeah, no, there's never any response because they don't want to engage with the substance, with the facts.
Ukrainian mission to the UN called Mr. Bose and Mr. Blumenthal 2 Russian stooges.
Yeah.
Bose is of no interest to me at all, the Ukrainian ambassador to the UN, Sergei Kislistia, told RTE News. He's of no interest. That's why I just called him a Russian stooge.
Yeah.
I go to the UN Security Council for work and not for primitive propaganda shows. And then Mr. Bose said he should address the facts, which he didn't. Not a single Ukrainian delegate addressed these facts and said he was happy to debate. Well, that's not going to happen. This is my favorite part of this article is Richard Gowan, who's the UN director of the crisis group. You know, they send a lot of people into government in, you know, liberal European administrations, democratic administrations. I think Robert Malley, who's the key Iran negotiator for the US, was at the crisis group.
Yep.
They get a ton of money. And Richard Gowan said that that you know, there are real questions about the risks connected to sending arms to Ukraine, including the potential leakage of weapons into other conflict zones. These are worthy of a serious debate. But yesterday's meeting was not going to be that debate. It was all just a bit of UN theater, and it really wasn't important at all, which is why I just gave a long quote to an Irish state broadcaster. And so he's basically like, you know, we should talk about, here's Yvonne Murray. She's the global, is that Jacinda Ardern? I don't know. In her post PM role. Well, anyway, it was interesting what he's saying. He's saying, yeah, this is a problem. They are addressing a problem, but we shouldn't address the problem so loudly. And it wasn't the right way to address the problem. We should address the problem in a more toothless way where we allow it to continue to fester. Thank you, crisis group guy.
Yeah.
Let's have more crisis. Otherwise, you won't exist anymore. We won't need you.
Yeah. I love those critiques, like people who can't refute the arguments you're making, but aren't comfortable with the fact that you're making them because you're not a part of the club that they want to be in, because they want to be able to voice some mild dissent sometimes while still catering to the party line. So they have to virtue signal by pretending to care about the issues that you're raising while still asking that you be excluded from any discussion. And that's, you know, that's what we get so often.
It is a problem, but only I should address that problem. They're not part of the club.
Yeah.
I saw some NAFO people describe my speech as mental torture, and that was part of how I constructed it. And I got some question about how do you construct the speech? What goes into preparing a speech like that? And basically, together with my colleagues, we just lay out as much research as possible, prioritize the strongest pieces of research to elucidate the problem. And then I just keep practicing over and over with a stopwatch to see how much I can cram in to 12 minutes. That's what I did. And it seemed to work. It seemed to fit within the framework, and it upset all the right people. It drove NAFO completely insane. And I mentioned at the beginning that, you know, Randy Credicode, Come With Me, had just recently been in Donetsk and was witnessing HIMARS attacks all the time on civilian infrastructure, on civilian neighborhoods. And that really upset NAFO. They don't believe NAFO, by the way, being the pro-NATO, pro-war troll farm that exists to kind of intimidate and insult anyone, any public figure who criticizes it. That really upset them because they fundamentally believe everything that Western corporate media says, and they cannot accept that the Ukrainian military might actually be guilty of war crimes. So it kind of punctures their moral veil. But that, obviously, that wasn't the intention behind the speech. I think the intention behind this speech, since it wasn't going to be able to have the same kind of institutional impact that your appearances around the OPCW did, was to help give more people a language for challenging this proxy war and for understanding the consequences, which haven't even played out yet. We saw Dmitry Medvedev, former Russian president, state 2 days ago in an article that the risk of nuclear war has never been higher. It's actually higher now than it was during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So why are we doing this? Are we insane? And it is instructive to watch the responses, to watch the whole session. All the US, UK, France, all they were saying was the same. They were saying the same things that they were saying when Russia invaded in February, just that this invasion violates, international law, and Ukraine under Article 51 has the right to resist it with weapons, and Article 51 justifies everything we do, even though Ukraine is no longer defending territorial integrity according to Article 51 when it's attacking inside Russian Federation territory relentlessly and calling for ATACMS missiles to attack inside the Russian Federation. That has nothing to do with Article 51. So they are checked out. They're not really up to date on the situation right now. And they're definitely not, I'm referring to the NATO members of the Security Council. They are definitely not doing anything to embrace the UN Charter, which calls for a pacific resolution to disputes. They are sabotaging the UN Charter.
Yeah, and they're doing it at a very dangerous moment, which we can talk about now.
Yeah. Ukraine
has been issuing these warnings that Russia is somehow preparing an attack on the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant. And now that we're seeing videos coming out, sort of like the White Helmet style in Syria, in preparation for the false flag chemical attacks that happened there, of Ukrainians preparing for some sort of nuclear strike or some sort of strike by Russia on the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant. And this is one of the headlines that are being fed to credulous Western media outlets like the New York Post. Ukraine preparing for nuclear explosion as Russian troops ordered to leave Zaporizhzhia plant. The whole world is watching. And Zelensky was the first person to make this public and saying that Ukraine has received intelligence that Russia is preparing some sort of radiation leak at the nuclear plant. And everybody is taking it seriously. What gets left out of the discussion on this is that, first of all, it's Russia that occupies this plant and has for months. And it's been Ukraine that's been launching a counteroffensive trying to retake the plant for months, and is in the process of that has been shelling the plant. And we're not allowed to learn that in Western media. It literally never gets reported that Ukraine has been shelling the plant. The way it's reported in places like the New York Times, the Washington Post, is that it's ambiguous. It's unclear who is shelling the plant that is currently being occupied by Russia and that Ukraine is trying to retake. And so when Ukraine puts out this warning that Russia is planning to somehow blow up the plant, it's taken seriously because we've been denied the basic fact that Ukraine is the one that's been shelling it for many, many months now, trying to retake it. And the Ukrainian narrative, though, just took a really, really big hit from the head of the IAEA, Grossi, who was recently interviewed about Ukrainian claims, and he basically shut them down in very diplomatic terms, but nonetheless refuted what Zelensky has been saying.
In Ukraine is saying, Vladimir Zelensky a few days ago said that according to his intelligence, Russia has made all the preparation for an attack on the plant, not an accident, an attack. This chief of military intelligence said that preparations are being done. Russian troops have moved vehicles charged with explosives into the plant. They've mined the cooling pond. You have a team on the ground. Is this what they're witnessing?
Well, I would never, enter into an argument with the president of Ukraine, whom I know very, very well, and with whom I've been in contact regularly and meeting with him personally. What I can say is I was there. I did not see this kind of development. Our teams are there, and they are reporting every day what's happening. I'm not privy to this intelligence report that you are referring to.
Right. So you don't think that there will be a Russian attack on the plant? It's not what you're seeing.
What I'm saying is that we don't see what you just said. in terms of the future, I wouldn't be so, adventurous into getting to, what is going to happen or not happen there. I think anything can happen. This is what worries me.
Right.
So he's basically calling Zelensky a liar. That's what he's doing
Yep.
in very polite terms. He says, I wouldn't want to get into an argument with Zelensky, but everything he's saying is unsubstantiated. The team that's been there, the inspectors that have been there haven't seen that. And so long as he keeps saying that, I wonder how long he'll last in that position. Because as we know, there's a precedent of NATO powers using institutions, global watchdogs like the IAEA and the OPCW to serve their pro-war narrative. So I don't know. That's something to watch out for. But
well, we've heard about, in the Bush administration, this Office of Special Plans inside the Pentagon of neocons that stovepiped intelligence.
Yeah.
And they were using it to influence international institutions as well as the media. You can assume there's a similar unit inside the Biden administration, probably might be in the NSC or the NSC itself. And they're probably stovepiping intelligence to the IAEA to try to get them to spout their line. They're definitely working the media in the US. And obviously the Senate through the top warmongers, Richard Blumenthal and Lindsey Graham of the Uniparty. This is where it's going. I mean, this is where this deception, it's already a deception, is going, and it's very troubling. It might be one of the most troubling stages of this war.
Blumenthal, and I want to put everybody in this body and this Congress on notice that the threat of a use of a nuclear device by Russia is real. And the best way to deter it is to give them clarity, the Russians, as to what happens if they do that. They will be in a war with NATO.
Poland is at immediate risk if the use of tactical nuclear weapons or destruction of a nuclear power plant causes radiation to spread, as almost certainly it would, causing significant human harm. This is not a kind of reckless or panicky resolution. It's based on fact and science, and it is meant to send a message to Vladimir Putin and even more directly to his military. They will be destroyed. They will be eviscerated if they use tactical nuclear weapons, or if they destroy a nuclear plant in a way that threatens surrounding NATO nations. Article 5 is there for a reason.
that's one of my favorite lines I've ever heard so far from these senators throughout the course of this proxy war. Lindsey Graham's been the source of so many, for example, when he said that, you know, as long as we aid Ukraine with military support, they'll fight to the last person, basically celebrating the sacrifice of Ukrainians for his hegemonic goals. But Blumenthal there, he says, Senator Blumenthal there says that this is not a panicky or reckless resolution. And then a couple of, breaths later, he goes on to threaten war with nuclear war on Russia and like threatening to destroy them. Yeah. So this is not panicky. And by the way, I'm threatening Armageddon against Russia. And I'm doing it based on the evidence-free allegations of Ukraine, who have constantly accused Russia of things that they're not guilty of. Remember when those air defense missiles from Ukraine crossed into Poland? Immediately, Zelensky said that Russia did it. An anonymous senior U.S. official backed him up. That turned out to be a complete lie, but that was the closest we had come to direct NATO military intervention, which Zelensky was asking for, based on the false allegation that Russia had launched those missiles into Poland, when in fact it was Ukrainian air defenses. And they've done that so many times now. When Nord Stream was blown up, Russia was accused of doing that too. So now Russia is accused by Ukraine of plotting to blow up a nuclear power plant that it's currently occupying. And then immediately these senators introduce a measure threatening war with Russia based on that evidence-free allegation. And those of us like in the public, how are we supposed to take that? You have a pattern of deceptions intended to fuel the war. And now you have a measure explicitly threatening Russia with annihilation based on another one of these allegations. And like, it's hard not to feel extremely alarmed at this, because we're talking about a nuclear war here based on nuclear allegations. And I mean, at best, Ukraine is trying to distract the world from how badly the counteroffensive is going, or it's just bluffing in the hopes that that will pressure, that will somehow lead to pressure on Russia to withdraw from the nuclear plant, to give it back to Ukraine, which is Russia, I don't think, is going to do. That's the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is that an actual false flag is being planned. I don't think that's what it is, and that could just be me being optimistic and hoping, for the world to survive. But honestly, I have to hope that these people aren't crazy enough to do something like that. But the problem is when you have this paranoid Cold War mindset that's completely taken over Washington, and you have a Ukrainian government that's dominated by a far right clique that hates anything to do with Russia and won't accept any kind of negotiation with Russia, you have to leave it open that these kind of scenarios are possible. And it's a very scary thought.
Well, that was the scenario I raised at the UN, was that what Graham and Blumenthal are doing is setting down another red line reminiscent of the one that was officially established by the Obama administration in Syria. And as Charles Glass, in his Harper's piece called The Red Line, reported, quoting I guess it was a former State Department official or former US diplomat, the red line was an invitation for a false flag. Because when you're saying that if anything happens around this nuclear power plant, if Russia attacks it, that we will come in and destroy Russia's army, and you are losing, you're getting clobbered, your counteroffensive is going nowhere, and you're running out of men and materiel, what else can you do?
Yeah.
So you take the situation in Duma, Syria, when the last vestige of the Saudi-backed Jaish al-Islam militia, its most radical wing, was refusing to negotiate, was on the verge of defeat in April 2018 with the Syrian army. The whole proxy war, that whole dirty war, was being wrapped up by the Syrian army. They have nothing left but to just start showing images of kids being hosed down and a bunch of dead bodies in a basement to trigger Western intervention. And they know that the Western media will tell their story uncritically, and it will create panic through the Beltway Press Corps. The Beltway Press Corps will put pressure on President Trump, someone who is much less inclined towards this kind of action than maybe Joe Biden, but maybe someone who might even be more inclined towards sloppiness, and his kids were supposedly putting pressure on him. I mean, just take that situation and transpose it into the current reality where Ukraine's military is faltering badly. The success of its counteroffensive will depend on how much weapons it gets going forward, and essentially how long this war will last. It needs to break through to Melitopol and past Zaporizhzhia and get close to the Black Sea, so it can threaten Crimea and strike Crimea and start terrorizing the Crimean population to supposedly force Russia to the negotiating table. That's their plan, and it's not happening. So you got to go to plan B. And as we saw, let's pretend that the CIA is right here. Let's pretend that, according to the Discord chats, let's pretend that the assessments that we're seeing in the Washington Post and Wall Street Journal are correct, and that Ukraine's military did authorize a covert action to bomb the Nord Stream pipelines without Zelensky knowing. If that's true, how hard would it be for them to authorize some kind of false flag attack around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant to trigger Article 5, and at the very least a Polish military invasion of Western Ukraine, which would be followed then by US peacekeepers to at least freeze the conflict to preserve the post-Maidan regime? How far-fetched is that? I unfortunately don't think it's very far-fetched.
And look, here's Zelensky talking recently. This is what he says. He says, Zelensky, before the NATO summit, which is coming up, in a week or so, before the NATO summit, we have to show results, but every kilometer costs lives. So he's acknowledging there that Ukraine's counteroffensive, it's a lot of people on his side are being sacrificed, but yet we have to show results. There's this pressure on him to show results, to bleed Russia. And yeah, I agree with you. Unfortunately, the scenario of a false flag in the context of this war and all the deception that's happened, it's not far-fetched. It just isn't. I still would like to think that they're not crazy enough to do that, but you can't rule it out. You just can't, especially based on everything. when you have the premier neocons in Congress, Lindsey Graham and Richard Blumenthal, introducing this measure to basically repeat the red line scenario of Syria, you just can't rule this stuff out, unfortunately.
So there is desperation in the ranks of the Ukrainian military. I mean, you can feel it. I wouldn't, at least deep disappointment. I don't know if this is a point to move on from Zaporizhzhia or if there's anything else you want to add.
Well, let me just show, here's another indication of how badly things are going for Ukraine, that they felt compelled to do this.
It's very important have to have this made decision about this compact of democratic steps.
Yes, they brought in Greta Thunberg. That's how badly things are going for
they're
Ukraine.
like, well, we're not getting the ATACMS, so we'll bring in the Thunberg. I mean, what does Greta Thunberg have to do with this? What does this have to do with climate change?
I mean,
nothing.
Yeah, I mean, like, you'd think if that was her concern, she could speak out against the bombing of the Nord Stream pipelines, right? That, as far as I understand, was not very good for the planet, but nothing there. I just, you know, I wasn't one of the, like, I avoided the whole Greta Thunberg thing because I just, whatever. But so many people promoted her as the answer to climate change and championed her as this hero. And now she's like going and like meeting with Zelensky. And also, if you read some statements she made, it was like a carbon copy of a State Department press release, literally, in terms of like the verbiage, like something about Russia's unprovoked criminal invasion of Ukraine. It was like literally whatever she said was taken exactly from the State Department. So whoever called her out as like a fraud and even as an op, I mean, I got to say, they're looking pretty good right now.
Well, Corey Morningstar did the first really thorough takedown of Greta Thunberg, showing how her school strike was sponsored by a startup firm run by a Swedish entrepreneur who was heavily invested in renewable technology, which is put forward as the answer to climate change. And then from there, she was supported by every major foundation, Rockefeller Foundation, Rockefeller Brothers Fund, which also supports Naomi Klein, who was there to host her for a talk when she came over on her messianic voyage on a supposedly carbon-free ship that was pedaled by like hamster wheels. No one talked about how she got home. But I'd never heard of this child before. And she was said to have superpowers that rendered her, first of all, above criticism, but also capable of divining the truth, a kind of Joan of Arc figure, because she was autistic or had Asperger's. I think that's what it was. And I mean, I'm no offense to, people who have autism or who are children, but being a child or having autism doesn't render you beyond critique if you are being used by powerful institutions run by very wealthy adults. And now we see that Greta Thunberg is fulfilling the most severe critiques of her critics and opponents, including from the right wing, which is that she's just a psyop, because she's going to Ukraine, which, according to the official story now in US media, is responsible for one of the worst attacks on the ozone layer in human history, with the massive release of methane gas from the Nord Stream pipelines. I mean, if you believe that Ukraine was responsible for that, as the Washington Post is reporting, then you should kind of be upset. You should ask some questions of Zelensky. Then Greta Thunberg blamed the Kakhovka Dam collapse on Russia when there was absolutely no evidence to support that, and accused it of eco-terrorism, along with fellow renewable industry lobbyist Bill McKibben from 350.org. I mean, what is McKibben doing weighing in on this? It just shows the bias, but also what they're used for. And Zelensky himself is kind of a psyop. It's just a meeting of two psyops. They represent, with their figure, two of the most important priorities for the transnational elite that meets in Davos. Climate change is a priority, not necessarily to save the earth, because, their solution is going to require tons of dirty mining in places like the Congo. It's to tap into this resource of trillions of dollars in minerals that are going to be used to produce renewable sources of energy like solar, wind, all the carbon capture technology. And with global capitalism in a crisis, there aren't that many untapped resources like this left. So that's a priority, along with the Ukraine war, for the reasons that I outlined in my UN speech and that we talk about here all the time, Aaron, which is that it's a cash cow for the upper middle class in Washington that has an upper class from Washington to Orange County, California, that has vested interests in arms sales. The U.S. military budget is at its highest level, adjusted for inflation, since World War II. It's the only time in history that it was higher was World War II, and that's making a lot of people a lot of money. That's Zelensky's role right now. So that's why they met.
And meanwhile, here's another illustration of how badly the counteroffensive is going for Ukraine. New reports now of the U.S. Planning to send weapons that it previously ruled out for Ukraine. So here's the first such weapon system. This is from anywar.com. Report: U.S. close to providing Ukraine with widely banned cluster bombs. So before, even Antony Blinken had ruled out sending cluster munitions to Ukraine. But now, of course, with the counteroffensive not going as advertised, they're reversing that. And cluster munitions are banned, of course, because they're indiscriminate. And long after they're used, they wound people or even kill them, as was the case in Vietnam, for example, where the U.S. used clusters widely. So that's one weapon system that's now on the table and being prepared to send. And now here's another one. This is from the Wall Street Journal recently. U.S. considers ATACMS long-range missiles to bolster Ukraine's fight. Officials see new urgency after long reluctance to provide advanced missile system. Yes, this new urgency comes because the U.S. and its allies pushed Ukraine into launching this counteroffensive just to show some results, which basically means killing Russians, even though Ukraine doesn't have air superiority and has been taking a lot of losses. And so now, because already this counteroffensive is not going well, now it's like, okay, let's send in the ATACMS, which would give Ukraine the capability to strike, deep into Crimea, for example. And that's just like, it's a new step on the escalation ladder. And the question is, where does it end? Where does it keep going? Because so many weapon systems that have previously been ruled out, Leopard tanks, F-16s, like all these different weapon systems.
Stingers were originally ruled out.
Stingers, yeah, everything.
And then in March, they were ruled out. In April, they were authorized. I don't know what they did. The Javelins seem to have been fairly effective, or pretty effective. The HIMARS have been effective, especially in terrorizing the population in Donetsk, although they're running very low on them and they're extremely expensive. The ATACMS are also extremely expensive, which is good for people who invest in Lockheed. The Leopard tanks have proven pretty useless, and the Ukrainians seem to have stopped driving them straight towards Russian lines. The Stryker armored personnel carriers have been proven useless. They are too heavy and they are too lightly armored, and they've been getting burned left and right. They're also very expensive. I think they cost $8 billion each, $8 million each. They're extremely, not 8 billion, 8 million each. The French, there's a French tank that Alexei Reznikov, the Ukrainian defense minister, posed with. Those have been extremely ineffective because they're lightly armored. They have good, good cannons. I think he called it like a sniper rifle on wheels, but that's not what's needed right now. And one was actually seen getting blown up by an Russian artillery strike that didn't even hit it directly. So all of these Western weapons to Ukraine are not necessarily a panacea. They certainly haven't helped yet in the counteroffensive. And then you have the ATACMS. What is the purpose of those? I mean, the purpose of those, I think, is just to cause terror against the civilian population. Although what they say is that they want to attack the Russian bases and the Russian barracks, which are deep in Crimea and are outside the range of the HIMARS. So, William Burns, the CIA director, went to Ukraine on a kind of surprise visit, and the Ukrainian High Command presented him with its ideal scenario for ending the war. I guess he wanted to know how this whole thing is going to end. And they called for holding hostage, according to the Washington Post, the entire population of Crimea by bombarding it with powerful weapons, presumably that would be the ATACMS, to, quote, gain leverage over Russia. So to use state terror creates so much panic and chaos in Crimea that Putin is forced to negotiate. And then I assume what the US would try to do in this fantasy scenario is get Russia to give up Donetsk, Lugansk, all the entire area on the left bank of the Dnipro that they've captured. And that doesn't seem likely right now. But it also highlights the goals that keep Russia so heavily invested in this conflict and makes them see it as existential when the Ukrainian High Command is calling for holding hostage a part of that region that Russia considers theirs.
All right, because of time, I think we can move on from Ukraine and do the rest of what we had planned on that topic on Friday, because we have other topics to get to, right?
We do. We can talk about Ukraine forever. And we will be. So, well, yeah, I was at the UN. I was attacked by the French ambassador also. And after the end of the session, I saw him come up to the Russian ambassador and shake his hand. And the Russian ambassador said to him, "So you didn't like our experts?" And he said, "Actually, I wasn't even there. I didn't even watch their speeches." But he called us so-called experts or something. Then he sort of sprinted off, and I wanted to ask him about what was happening in France, because it was really fascinating in this session at the UN to hear constantly about Prigozhin, how Prigozhin's mutiny had showed that Russia was being destabilized. And of course, we covered this. We've been following it. It was inescapable if you were just an American passing through an airport or turning on your TV in a hotel. You couldn't escape the specter of Yevgeny Prigozhin, someone who no American knew of before last week, who staged a armed protest or armed rebellion, marched towards Moscow. The whole thing was over in like 24 hours. I don't know how many people were killed. There might have been less killed than on January 6th, but it didn't exactly consume Russia in flames as our Beltway media and expert class seemed to yearn for. They were yearning for a bloody civil war. I think Michael McFaul said openly that the civil war had already broken out in yet another McFail. It never did. Meanwhile, France, just days later, has been consumed in riots over the killing of a 17-year-old. I think he was like a bike courier, delivered food on a motorcycle, was pulled over by the police. The police killed him, apparently in cold blood, after claiming that he shoved the police officer. The CCTV does not show that. And in Marseille, which has a very large population of Arab and North African immigrants, this was a immigrant youth who was killed. Riots immediately broke out, and they've spread across France. And Emmanuel Macron was on his way to Germany for a state visit. That would have been the first French state visit to Germany in 21 years. It was a very significant visit. It was going to deal with Ukraine and among other issues. And here's the kind of, these are some of the scenes we've been seeing. Macron also got in enough time, got the chance to dance at an Elton John concert before returning home to deal with this crisis. And these riots in France have been erupting since 2005. particularly in the suburbs of cities where the immigrant population is segregated from the rest of society and lives under heavy surveillance and police repression. We've seen round after round of riots, but this is by far the most intense. And the crisis continues to develop. The fires are spreading. Over 1,000 have been arrested. Scores and scores of police have been injured. And it's a full-scale crisis for Emmanuel Macron. But I was just watching CNN before our live stream, Aaron, and they were covering Ukraine. They weren't touching this. This wasn't something they were interested in covering inside a NATO state. I don't know. I'm not hearing any calls for humanitarian intervention.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, sort of this was the scenario that we were told was going to happen in Russia as a result of the war. Like Bill Burns, the director of the CIA, talked about how U.S. sanctions were going to hurt generations of Russians, and Russian society, we were told, was going to implode. But now, actually, because of the dysfunctions in NATO states, we're actually seeing those scenes playing out in countries like France. And we're also seeing, deep hardship in the UK and other NATO states because they, in their bid to cut themselves off from Russia, they've ultimately, I think, hurt themselves. And I'm not saying that the riots in France are a result of that, but certainly with like so much resources devoted to this proxy war that inevitably neglects people at home. And I mean, you know so much more about France than I do, Max, but and you've been writing about this before, I know, but like the racism in France that's so endemic, and how marginalized communities are totally segregated from like the metropolitan areas. I mean, these are the main factors, I imagine you'd agree, behind this current unrest.
Definitely. And just the onset of neoliberalism, that not all of these former Interior Minister Manuel Valls under Francois Hollande, which was a left of center government from the Socialist Party, called the situation that French immigrants live in the suburbs apartheid. Then Emmanuel Macron himself has acknowledged these conditions, but they're never addressed. Nothing has changed. So in 2015, I was in France on a speaking tour to talk about Palestine, which is more difficult than to do in the United States because there isn't free speech in France the way we understand it. There were many attempts to shut down my talks, including by the Jewish Defense League, which is a far-right terrorist group that's active in the illegal settlements in the occupied West Bank, but also by the French government itself, which many local municipalities have attempted to ban promotion of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. But on that nearly month-long speaking tour, along with my friend and colleague James Kleinfeld, we just interviewed people in the suburbs and around France about the crisis that was engulfing French society. And it was at a time when ISIS and Al-Qaeda were on the march in Syria. I think that part of the analysis was maybe missed, but we ultimately produced a documentary called Je ne suis pas Charlie after the attacks on a kosher supermarket and the Charlie Hebdo satirical magazine by pro-Al-Qaeda elements. And this really brought the crisis to the fore. I'll show a short clip from that, starting with our interview with a guy who sympathizes with the Jewish Defense League outside of a French suburb that is inhabited by North African Jews and North African Muslims that had a heavy military presence while we were there. And, it cuts into some of the anti-Muslim media that's regularly featured on French TV. This is from our 2015 documentary, Je ne suis pas Charlie. He's talking about raising up paramilitary organizations to defend Jews in the suburbs. And he's asking the Ministry of Defense to support them and arm them for a civil war.
Oh, Max, the video is not coming through.
And it's not coming through. So I will go back. And this is a scene from Je ne suis pas Charlie, a documentary I made in 2015 with James Kleinfeld. And this guy is calling for the French Ministry of Defense to support Jewish paramilitary organizations against the local Muslim population in expectation of a civil war.
Premièrement, ils sont encadrés. Deuxièmement, ils seront plus responsables. Lorsqu'on fait descendre l'armée pour protéger des Français contre d'autres Français, c'est un début de guerre civile.
We call on the army to protect some French people from others. We're heading in that direction, he said.
While French Jews have been targeted in major violent attacks.
Then here's a far-right nationalist
Muslims in
group
France
occupying a
suffered for
mosque
years
in
from
2012.
routine street harassment and racist invective from mainstream pundits in primetime media.
This is French mainstream media.
Ce que j'appelle l'islamofascisme.
French public feel threatened by Islamofascism. That's Eric Zemmour, who ran for president. Islam is a religion of war. This fifth column works in networks that have infiltrated our basements and garages. This is the Third World War. This is, I think, Alan Finkielkraut.
Oui, je suis islamophobe, et alors? Mais c'est normal, bien sûr.
Of course, I'm against Islam. It's causing problems.
Si on veut que l'islam devienne un islam de France, il faut imposer sa laïcisation.
We must impose secularism on Islam.
Peut-être je suis islamophobe et je veux ce soir.
I come out as an Islamophobe. That's Véronique Genet. I'm like many people, French people, an Islamophobe. This is Richard Millet. I cannot stand mosques in France. So, you know, the reality that we portrayed in that film is unchanged. If anything, it's worse, because the situation in the suburbs is unaddressed. And we've covered this at the Grayzone, thanks to Jeremy Lafredo, producing several video documentaries on the protests against the pension reforms of Emmanuel Macron. I mean, Macron is a billionaire banker who is there to loot what's left of French public assets in the French social compact and transform France into a more American-style economy, supposedly to preserve it economically. But he's stripping away protections that people had, while there's really nothing for the people who live completely segregated in the suburbs. So what we have here is just an expression of desperation, of hopelessness. Watch the film La Haine. I don't know if you've seen that. It's called Hate in English. This is a great French film by Matty Kassovitz, I believe. And it perfectly explains or depicts this situation in black and white. It's about the killing of a youth in the projects in a French suburb and the riots that break out. Nothing has changed since then. The only thing that I think has changed maybe is that the French public, despite the yellow vest protests, is more impotent to resist it than ever before, because of the power of the security state, because of the power of financial capital in France, because of the economic weakness that they suffer from. So the outcome of these riots will be decidedly negative. There's not much to celebrate there. It looks completely nihilistic to me, without any political direction, and it will definitely not benefit the French left or the anti-Macron elements that came out in the streets to protest the pension reforms. It will not benefit the yellow vests. What it will lead to is a strengthening of figures like Marine Le Pen, as well as the security state and the police themselves. And I mean, and this is fascinating in light of what we were hearing about Prigozhin's mutiny. The French police are saying that we are at war with vermin and threatening a revolt over the rioting. They're demanding a harder hand from Macron and threatening to commit mutiny against Macron unless he steps in with more militarized force. That is one element that is gaining strength thanks to these riots. I mean, the grandmother of Nahel M., the victim, the 17-year-old victim of the police killing, has called for the violence to stop because she can see how destructive it is for her cause. But I think it's very destructive for the anti-Macron left. And it's a great day. It's a field day for Marine Le Pen, who's issued a message that's careening around social media calling for much harsher repression and calling out Macron as weak.
That's really sad. Macron, I don't know if this video is authentic or, was accurately dated, but because it's the internet, so you never know. But there's a video of him like enjoying an Elton John concert. And the claim was that he was doing this as all this was happening. And if that's true, if that timeline is correct, and that's just such a reflection of who he is and how out of touch that sort of liberal elite he represents is with their own population.
Yeah, I mean, it's a problem that they have no means of addressing the problem. What Macron has done, and I mean, I'm not saying that there isn't some truth to it, but what he has done is blamed social media for the rioting. And of course, as France burns, Macron blames social media for fanning the flames. He says the role of video platforms in national violence is causing copycat attacks, and it's making it worse than in 2005 when before TikTok, Snapchat, and Twitter. Okay, well, it was Emmanuel Macron and people around him, as well as people around the National Endowment for Democracy and all across Washington, or Anne-Marie Slaughter, who praised TikTok, Snapchat, Twitter, especially Twitter, for fanning the flames of revolt across the Arab world during the so-called Arab Spring, which led to total social chaos because they wanted to overthrow those governments. And Emmanuel Macron has repeatedly called for the regime change and the so-called liberation of populations, including in Lebanon during protests there, the former French colony. So in many ways, this is chickens coming home to roost. It's just sad that the result will be so negative for forces that actually want to roll back the march of neoliberalism in France. And Macron has called for shutting down social media, completely shutting down or banning and censoring posts that cause, in his view, social unrest. I think, the censors, the Jen Easterlys at CISA are watching this and are going to use this to advance the censorship agenda, the social media censorship agenda across the West, for fear of their own restive populations in the US. I mean, we saw how quickly the switch of Black Lives Matter was turned on in 2020. It wasn't exactly turned off because ultimately it was making America look chaotic during Trump's final year, or during Trump's reelection run. But I think, that will be another outcome of these riots, is more social media censorship.
You can always count on events like this to be exploited by the state to, increase their powers. And you can always count on them also to invoke the Russia boogeyman. So here is the Daily Telegraph. How Russia is using French riots as propaganda. Russia press reports unrest in France spreading to other countries is proof that Western liberalism is destroying Europe. So you can always count, no matter what's happening, whether, it's like Nazis in Ukraine. We saw those New York Times stories recently about how the fact that there's so many Nazis in Ukraine and they're so visibly displaying Nazi iconography that's awkward, and that might even help Russian propaganda. You can always count on any issue that the West has being somehow tied to Russia and being framed as being how this could possibly help Russian propaganda, and therefore we shouldn't even acknowledge it, I guess.
Well, what they're doing is blaming Russia for what the domestic nationalist right in France is saying, which is that Western liberalism has done this with, open immigration and, lax policing, too much emphasis on rights. I mean, that's what Marine Le Pen is saying openly, and many millions of French people agree with her. It's not Russia causing them to do that. And remember when Russia was falsely blamed for hacking Macron's emails to support Marine Le Pen, and there were said to be all these Russian transactions that were paying for her re-election, her election. I mean, it's simply a way of justifying repression against right-wing nationalist elements. Is Russia controlling the young nationalist men who are coming out with nightsticks and truncheons to beat up protesters across France right now? I feel like they might have more organic motivations driving them.
Yeah.
But this will still be going on by the time we're speaking next week, I think. And I think the US media will continue to place it on page A15. I mean, you can just go to the New York Times, Washington Post, scroll down, and you'll find more about Prigozhin up top than you will about these riots. So I don't know if you want to talk about Jenin at all, or we can
listen, I think we should get, Max, some quick thoughts from you about Jenin. This is really serious. This is Israel's launched a massive military assault on the West Bank town of Jenin, like a center of resistance, Palestinian resistance in the West Bank, and it's the images are horrible. And this is Israel has used air power, has launched airstrikes, I believe, for the first time in 2 decades on Jenin, and the images coming out are pretty horrific. So I was hoping to get your thoughts on it. You having written the book Goliath and spent a lot of time in the West Bank, what tell us what's going on here.
Well, here's some imagery of the. Well, Jenin is part of the northern West Bank that is, along with Nablus, the historic center of resistance to armed resistance to Israeli occupation, the Jenin refugee camp. And in 2002, that camp was destroyed by Ariel Sharon. He called it the cockroach's nest and brought bulldozers through the center of the camp. One bulldozer driver, whose nickname was Kurdi Bear, was interviewed by the Israeli newspaper Yediot Aharonot about his rampage through the camp, where he said he built a football stadium by just destroying house after house. He said he was naked, wrapped only in an Israeli flag with a bottle of Jameson. And he just destroyed houses for 2 days straight. And he was kind of considered a hero. And they thought that they had quelled the resistance in the Jenin camp. There's the film Jenin, which is about the destruction of Jenin. But there's also a documentary I would really recommend to everyone watching this right now called Arna's Children, about Arna Hamis, who was a Israeli anti-Zionist whose son, Giuliano Meir Hamis, her name was Arna Meir, like Meir, and she married a Palestinian man and had a son named Giuliano Meir Hamis, who I actually knew before he was killed, who called himself 100% Palestinian, 100% Israeli. And he started a theater in the Jenin refugee camp with the youth who had actually fought in the Battle of Jenin in 2002. And I mean, it's said that theater was bombed or attacked. Israel is denying it. But there were attempts to try to answer the outrage. And the Palestinian Authority came in 2005 through 2007 with the so-called Dayton Plan, General Keith Dayton and a contractor called DynCorp to train the Palestinian Authority to basically serve as an occupation subcontractor and prevent armed resistance from taking place, specifically in Nablus and Jenin. And now we are seeing, in other words, the Palestinian Authority under the Oslo Accords is prevented from defending Palestinians against Israeli violence. And now we're seeing the Palestinian Authority police stations are being attacked by people in Jenin. So what has happened since then? Since then, we've seen resistance intensify in Gaza, which sends a message to the West Bank that this is possible. It's much harder for them to get weapons, but they still manage to do so through the black market, including buying them through the Israeli military, from off Israeli soldiers, and through the PA. And enough capacity has been built in the Jenin camp and in Nablus to create an organization called the Lion's Den, which transcends the factional rivalries of Hamas and Fatah, and the PFLP. It's young people who are no longer interested in the sectarianism and the politics and just simply want to resist the Israeli occupation. And since 2021, they have been confronting Israeli soldiers in the streets. There was a major standoff in Nablus with the Israeli military, and they've grown stronger and stronger in Jenin. And meanwhile, settler violence has gotten more intense. We saw a settler pogrom in the village of Huara outside Nablus earlier this year, in which over 100 Palestinian cars and Palestinian homes were torched by settlers who rampaged through the center of town. If you live in these cities, you're completely unable to reach other cities, and settlers will attack you if you try to do so. And the Israeli military has checkpoints set up everywhere. And so Israel has decided to come in with over 1,000 soldiers, including aircraft, which we haven't seen since the Second Intifada, and to actually carry out the kind of airstrikes we've seen in Gaza on centers of armed resistance in Jenin, specifically of the so-called Lion's Den. And the resistance forces in Jenin are actively fighting. Here's some footage of some of the fighting. This is a Palestinian fighter yesterday fighting invading Israeli forces, and they're coming in with the same powerful bulldozers we saw in 2002 and doing much the same. The Israeli military, for its part, has said that this won't end the problem. It won't answer it, but it's the start of something, and that something had to be done. And that speaks to the political pressure that's been put on Benjamin Netanyahu by the extremist members of his, well, if you can call, I mean, I used to think of Netanyahu as kind of an extremist, but now he's the moderate in this coalition with members of the Otzma Yehudit party, the Jewish power party, who are hardcore Kahanists, who including Itamar Ben-Gvir, one of the most fanatical settler figures in Israeli history, who has called for last week, he called for the killing of thousands of Palestinians to end this problem. So the army is just there to do something. They're wreaking havoc on Jenin. They're escalating. They're using airstrikes, 500-pound bombs. And we haven't seen the end of this. The fighting is continuing as we speak in an area that was supposed to have been quelled and pacified by 2007. I don't know if there's anything to add there, except that why is Israel doing this? Well, they're doing this because they can't allow any resistance to their ongoing program of settler colonization. And this same week, even the UK and France have denounced Israel for building so many illegal colonies in the West Bank. That's ultimately what this is about. And administration after US administration has sponsored Israel with more aid each year than all of Africa receives.
That point you made earlier about how under Oslo, under the so-called peace process, Palestinians are basically like the Palestinian police. They're not able to, like, what was it you said that they're not allowed to do? They're not allowed to actually help.
They're not allowed to defend Palestinians against.
Yeah. And so just today, Abbas has announced that he's suspending security cooperation with Israel, which is a performance that we see every single time there's like a particularly egregious massacre. Then the Palestinian Authority says, okay, we're stopping to collaborate. But of course, it's completely performative, because as soon as the bodies are collected, people are buried, they go back to doing it, being a colonial subcontractor. And it's just unbelievable how long this is going on for. The difference is that it's because society has progressed in their sympathy for Palestinians and their understanding that they're living under apartheid. It's a lot harder now for pundits to get away with whitewashing this. 20 years ago, when this was happening in the Second Intifada, vocally, U.S. politicians, pundits were cheerleading Israel. And they're still doing that now, but it's more muted now. And now it's a lot harder to get away with it because people's consciousness has been expanded. But Norman Finkelstein recently published an article about something related to do with that era. So back then, when Israel was cracking down on the Second Intifada, you would constantly get people saying that all this is justified because Palestinians have always rejected peace. They've rejected Israel's generous peace offers. And there are these Camp David peace talks in the early aughts, which Clinton oversaw. And there was Palestinians that rejected this generous Israeli offer to basically give them back most of the West Bank. And it was a lie, but everybody played along with it. And now, only now are we starting to get more evidence about just what a lie it was, because as Norman Finkelstein writes about, Israeli archives have recently declassified Israel's response to the Clinton parameters, which was his proposal at Camp David. That was in July 2000, I believe, between Arafat and Ehud Barak in Maryland. And that was going to resolve the Israel-Palestine issue for good, but Arafat was blamed for the talks' collapse. Anyway, so the archives were released recently showing that Israel, in its official communications to the U.S. government about this, basically rejected everything that Clinton had proposed. And what Finkelstein points out is that Clinton lied. He blamed Arafat and the Palestinians for rejecting all this, and it basically exonerated Israel. But what these archives show is it was Israel that had rejected all of Clinton's basic proposals. And Clinton's basic proposals to begin with were completely unfair to the Palestinians because it presumes the right of Israel to have expelled hundreds of thousands of Palestinians to begin with, and then found their state. But basically, it's just an example of how propaganda works. The lie is told, the victims are blamed, and then 20 years later, whatever it is, we finally get the truth, but long after the damage is done. And now we're seeing the consequences of this playing out, where because of this propaganda narrative that's been built up over the years, that Israel is, just defending itself against these Palestinians that won't accept it and that don't want to live next to Jews, that's why this fighting has to continue, when it's in fact the exact opposite. It's a Jewish supremacist state that won't accept the basic rights of the Palestinians that it displaced to begin with, and that's why things like this continue now.
Well, and we also had during 2002 the wave of suicide bombing, which was precipitated by unprecedented Israeli violence in the West Bank, but it provided justification for Israel to build the apartheid wall and to subsume large parts of the West Bank and kind of unilaterally separate from Gaza and turn Gaza into a kind of open air prison, or consolidated as an open air prison. There isn't that same justification now. There's not a wave of attacks on Israeli civilians inside Israeli cities coming from Jenin. By the way, many of the youth from Jenin who had carried out those attacks had already had their homes bulldozed, because Israel bulldozes the homes of anyone who belongs to a resistance organization or carries out an attack. What you can see right now is Palestinians defending their own city. And so compare this to the justifications we hear for arming Ukraine with F-16s, arming Ukraine with battle tanks. It's Article 51 in the UN Charter, which allows a local population or a state to defend itself with arms against an invading force, to defend its territorial integrity. But because Palestinians are not granted an actual nation and at best have observer status at the UN, the Israelis say that invalidates Article 51. So what about it for a stateless population? Can a stateless population defend itself against an occupier? Of course. And the occupier is it's illegal for the occupier to move its civilian population during a conflict into another party's territory. That's what's happening here. That's pretty much it. And we're not hearing anyone call for arming the Palestinians with Leopard tanks and F-16s and Javelin missiles. They are completely powerless, and they're fighting with any arms that they can get, either off the black market or with rocks.
Yeah, and there's so many differences with Ukraine, but one difference is that this occupation has been going on for decades of occupation. And every time there's any effort to resolve the issue, Israel, with U.S. backing, undermines diplomacy. And by contrast, in Ukraine, there was something called the Minsk peace process, which was supposed to end the war in the Donbass, which Ukraine and all the NATO state partners flagrantly violated, refused to implement. Which then left the people of the Donbass who didn't want to live under a coup regime with very little choice, because the government that they were rebelling against refused to engage in any serious diplomacy and ignored even the agreements that they had signed. In fact, Andrei Yermak, who is Zelensky's top advisor, recently told the Wall Street Journal, he said that a major obstacle to peace in Ukraine was Russia's insistence that Ukraine live up to the Minsk Accords. And that basically means that Zelensky, that Yermak is saying that an obstacle to peace in Ukraine is asking Ukraine to live up to deals it's already signed. So, which is a great window into Ukraine's attitude. But in Palestine, by contrast, Israel's rejected all efforts at diplomacy and, in fact, used diplomacy, much like Ukraine and its allies used the Minsk so-called peace process, used it to only entrench the occupation further.
Exactly. And without any international support.
Yeah.
So the international support, to the extent they get it, is from Iran. That's one of the only states that's arming Palestine, but mostly in the Gaza Strip. And therefore, Iran is accused of supporting terrorism. When we arm Ukraine, it's supporting democracy. So the contradictions and hypocrisy couldn't be more clear as the fighting and the Israeli rampage in Jenin continues. And I think we'll just end it there and hopefully be back on Friday or as soon as we can be. It's kind of a holiday week. So we'll do the best we can to be back as soon as possible. But thanks everyone for liking this broadcast, this live stream, for all the super chats, comments, and for subscribing. Definitely sign up for our newsletter if you haven't done so yet, because you won't miss anything there. And check out Ann Garrison's piece on the site, thegrayzone.com, about the battle at Pacifica Radio, where you have this kind of pro-Democratic Party, pro-war faction, which is trying to take over the network. And we, the Grayzone, are broadcasting from the two most powerful Pacifica affiliates, KPFK in LA and WBAI in New York. So this concerns us too. So it's really important that everyone weigh in on that, on this kind of Trojan horse for turning Pacifica into Democracy Now, or allowing Democracy Now to completely subsume Pacifica. Beyond that, thanks for supporting us on Patreon, PayPal, and anything you want to add, Aaron?
No, thanks everybody. Please like the stream. We'll see you next time. Thanks for tuning in.
All right, peace.
Bye,
We're
everybody.
out.
Peace.